This video will go through Germany question 3. Now, it's always going to be a do the interpretation support the view question. It will be 10 marks, 10 minutes, and it will be 3 paragraphs in length. You'll be provided with 2 interpretations, and note that they are called interpretations and not sources. And you must explain how and crucially why these interpretations differ. So when they're given to you, they're normally from very different perspectives, maybe different countries or different sides or different ages. And that's what it wants you to do. So your rough structure is, as always, in the table on the right. In your first paragraph, you're going to be looking at content, context, and authorship of interpretation 1, and then explaining, does it support a factor? So it will ask you, does it support the view that the Nazis killed Jewish people? You need to explain, does that interpretation support that view or not? And exactly the same for interpretation 2, and then you will need a final judgment. Do both interpretations support the view, and why or why not? Now, normally they are different interpretations, but that's not necessarily going to always be true, so be aware of that. We'll do a practice question all together. The first thing we're going to do is look at our bug method. We've got do the interpretation support the view that the lives of women worsened under the Nazis. I'm going to box my command words, which in this case are do the interpretations support the view. I'm going to underline my key features, which are the lives of women worsened under the Nazis. And then I'm going to glare at the hints. So because it's an interpretation-based question, of course, I'm going to look at the marks and the sources, but also, to make sure I don't miss it out, I'm also going to make sure I look at the authorship as well, because that can tell you perhaps more about a source than the content can. So already straight away, as soon as I read that question about women under the Nazis, my brain's kind of gone into overdrive about context. You could talk about the 3 Ks. You could talk about motherhood being honoured. You guys know that they got medals depending on how many children they gave birth to. They're encouraged to want less freedom. So when you're talking about the lives of women worsened, you need to think about they were actually encouraged to want a worse life because they're judging it by our expectations. I know a lot about the physical appearance, so not being too skinny, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, wide hips for childbirth. And I also know that they're not included in work statistics. They want to be hidden, the invisible, unemployed. I could also probably include some stuff in there about the Nazis gaining power. So 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor. That's a crucial date to throw in there. Then I'm going to turn my attention to each of the interpretations at a time. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to be thinking about what they say about the lives of women. So interpretation 1 is talking about the humiliation of women. In work and appearance, yes, I would agree that women have a worse life. But in terms of position, I'm going to personally disagree with Gupta because, like my context says, they're actually encouraged not to want this. And also you've got the fact that Hitler's mother's birthday was a national holiday. Women are celebrated in Nazi Germany, but only if they can have children, which Gupta does go on to say. In terms of the author, she is a feminist historian. Feminism means they are kind of on the side of women and they want women to be equal to men. And this article is about the politics of gender. However, she's not described as a political historian. She's described as a feminist historian that would purely focus on women. So I think she's in a pretty good place to assess life for women. However, with her being a feminist, it's likely to be quite weighted towards thinking women are worse off. For interpretation 2, this interpretation is talking about women actually accepting their new role because they wanted a simpler way of life. And I'm sure that was true. And it doesn't talk about being worse, it talks about being different. So this interpretation does not support the view that women's lives became worse. They actually wanted it. In terms of authorship, you can absolutely go to town on this one. It's an unnamed author. It's a general information website, so suggests that there's not a lot of monitoring. And it's an article, so perhaps there is some research, but we can't guarantee this.
Interpretation 1 is written by Chira Gupta, a feminist historian, in an article The Politics of Gender, Women in Nazi Germany, published in a magazine in 1991. It explains how women's rights deteriorated under the Nazis, as women were forced to stay home and become mothers under the 3Ks, children, kitchen and church, and create the ideal family to promote the master-Aryan race. This interpretation supports the view that women's lives got worse during the rise of the Nazis. The author of this source is a feminist historian who is educated in the topic of women's rights throughout history. She would have this opinion about women in Nazi Germany because, as a feminist, she wants equal rights with men, and that certainly was not the case in Nazi Germany. Interpretation 2 is from an article published on the website GermanyCulture.com. A general information website, titled Women in Nazi Germany. It explains that many women supported the Nazis and were happy to return to being housewives as it was simpler. There were some people who wanted to return to a simpler way of life after seeing how changes had caused wars and economic depressions. The author is not mentioned, however, as the article is posted on a general information website. This suggests the author may not be fully educated on women's rights in Nazi Germany. You could suggest some form of research has been used in order to publish an article, but this is in no way guaranteed and offers quite a general perspective. This interpretation does not support the view that women's lives got worse and instead suggests German women wanted this shift. The interpretations do not both support the view that women's lives got worse, as Gupta is a feminist historian who may have wanted to highlight the lack of women's rights in Nazi Germany. Interpretation 2 may have been aimed to give an overall view of women in Nazi Germany. Interpretation 1 supports the view that the lives of women worsened under the Nazis, while Interpretation 2 suggests they lived happily.
We're now going to see 2 questions on the screen, and then sample answers, and then a mark scheme at the end.
Both interpretations are contemporary, of the time period, examples of reactions to the Treaty of Versailles, although they discuss the treaty in different ways. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919 and agreed the terms after the First World War ended in 1918. It was extremely harsh on Germany, but is still a contested issue as to whether or not it was fair. Germany had surrendered and was held to account by the Allies for all of the destruction of the First World War. A war like this had never been seen before, and the leaders of France, Britain and the USA wanted to make sure it never happened again. Interpretation 1 is written by Friedrich Ebert, who was the leader of the Weimar Republic shortly after the Treaty of Versailles. Ebert is very critical of the treaty and its harsh conditions, stating it is a mess caused by the Allies and they cannot afford to pay the reparations of 6,600 million marks. Ebert implies that the treaty is not fair because it is crushing Germany. However, Ebert does recognize that Germany cannot ignore the sanctions because they did lose the war. Ebert is talking to his own party, so he would be informing them about what was going on, therefore supporting the view that that off was unfair. Interpretation 2 is written by David Lloyd George, British Prime Minister in 1919. Both the French and British governments wanted to see stiff penalties placed on the Germans to deter them from starting another war in the future, such as limiting the number of soldiers to 100,000 and banning submarines. The USA seemingly didn't care and just wanted Europe to be peaceful again. Written from the perspective of the winners, George justifies the harsh punishment on Germany by saying that the treaty will not allow Germany to wage war, thus not supporting the view that the treaty was unfair. Interpretation 1 is more supportive of the view that the Treaty of Versailles was unfair towards Germany. However, it should be noted that it is written from the German perspective and would be more likely to suggest the treaty was too harsh and unfair. Interpretation 2 does imply that the treaty was unfair, but the harsh nature of the treaty is justified because it would eliminate any further attempts at war. Interpretation 1 is written by a German historian and former soldier in 1982. As a former soldier, he may have had first-hand accounts of the problems faced by Germany at this time. Furthermore, he is a historian, so will have researched the reasons for the collapse of Weimar, especially since this was published in a textbook. The author would most likely have been alive and aware of the various political uprisings in 1919 by the Spartacists, as well as the discontent people felt towards Weimar over food shortages and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The interpretation states that Weimar failed due to opposition from the army and political groups, and how the Nazis used the fear of communism, social disorder and international failure. Interpretation 2 supports the view that the Great Depression led to the collapse of Weimar. It is written by a British historian shortly after the war, which may have shaped his views about Weimar and the Nazis, as can be seen in the title of the book A Study in Tyranny, which is a biography about Hitler, and would therefore focus more on the context of the Great Depression. The interpretation says that Hitler and the Nazis presented serious opposition for Weimar, and Great Depression tipped the scales to cause Weimar to collapse. This interpretation suggests that without the Great Depression, Weimar may have been able to maintain control and not collapse. This may be because the author saw the Depression not only as a global problem, but one in Germany which could only be solved by the Nazis. Overall, interpretation 1 does not support the view that the Great Depression caused the collapse of Weimar, instead claiming it was the political unrest and general discontent. Interpretation 2 does support the view very overtly, noting that it forced the collapse of Weimar. They have different interpretations because of their origin, countries being on opposing sides, as well as personal experiences, with Brucker perhaps being better placed to assess the reasons for the collapse of the Weimar